guys, welcome back to another video. We have a very interesting article here from the New York Times talking about what happened between Activision Blizzard and NetEase. As we know, they could not come to a brand new deal, which back in January, they cut off their partnership, basically stopping Activision Blizzard games from being distributed in China, cutting off millions and millions of players from playing these extremely popular games. And we have some more information as to what went on here. Now, before we get into this, if you remember here, Bobby Kotick did put out this email to employees yesterday. And one of the things he does say is our proposed merger will help us compete in the increasingly competitive marketplace that includes rapidly growing foreign powerful companies that enjoy protection in their home markets and access to strong talent pools. Now, people are speculating who he's referring to here, but you could take a wild guess. He's referring to companies like Tencent and like NetEase, who are continuously growing, have huge power in their home countries, makes it very hard for any foreign companies to come in and compete with them. And they have the opportunity to come over here to the West and be able to compete because the rules are just completely different. And Microsoft, he says, will enable them to more effectively compete against these market-leading competitors. But let's go through the article because I think there's some interesting information here as to what happened between Activision Blizzard and NetEase. It says here, last October, executives at the Chinese gaming company NetEase and the American video game developer Activision Blizzard joined a Zoom video conference to discuss the future of their 14-year partnership to offer Activision games like World of Warcraft in China. So this was a 14-year partnership that just completely dissolved, obviously, after they couldn't come to an agreement on how they wanted to move forward. NetEase executives were worried about new laws imposed by the Chinese government and wanted to make changes to their long-standing contract with Activision to ensure they were in compliance. But the companies left the call with drastically different interpretations of what had been said. According to four people familiar with the talks and a document viewed by the New York Times, what NetEase executives contended was a conciliatory gesture was seen as a threat by Activision executives. A month later, the companies broke off talks. So that's huge right there. They were obviously on different wavelengths here in how these discussions were going. And NetEase felt threatened by Activision Blizzard, which is not a good thing. You don't want to do that before you're trying to enter into a new agreement, into a new partnership after 14 years of working together. In January, more than 3 million Chinese players lost access to Activision's iconic games when the partnership ended, and angry NetEase employees live streamed the dismantling of a 32-foot sculpture of an axe from World of Warcraft that stood outside NetEase's headquarters in Hangzhou, China. So that was crazy that they were extremely angry that this thing couldn't get worked out, and then they show them ripping down or taking apart that big sculpture. The testy breakup after months of talks ended a relationship that had seemed to prove that global commerce could thrive despite deepening geopolitical rifts, a partnership that had been worth about $750 million in annual revenue, according to company filings in the video game research firm Nico Partners, had become another case study in the increasing difficulty of doing business in China. And I mean, at the end of the day, we are in a time that we're living through here where there are difficulties, there's foreign conflicts going on, there's a lot of things happening, and this is just another sign that things may not be moving in the best direction. Details of the breakdown in negotiations between Activision and NetEase provide an unusual behind-the-scenes look at how Chinese and American companies are struggling to balance the interests of the Chinese government with what they believe is the best for their business. And now, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that is not the same issues that when like NetEase or Tencent are coming over to the West that they have to deal with. And this is something that you can tell Xbox and Microsoft are getting ready for, is competing with massive companies that make a ton of money in China, like Tencent, and they're going to be able to take all of the investment and money that they've made from there and then go over and reinvest it in the West, in the video game sector. Those are going to be the bigger competitors for Microsoft and for Xbox going forward, more so than Sony. I mean, Sony kind of has that same deal with Japan, as like they are massive in Japan, but they also are competing there with Nintendo, and Xbox is in Japan. Not sure why they don't do as good, other than they are an American company in Japan. They don't provide all of the same types of games that the Japanese gamers like, and they're still growing there. But let's say in 10 years from now, Game Pass just has an insane amount of games that gamers in Japan like. You're going to see Xbox continue to grow, and people still do buy the Xboxes in Japan. I mean, not nearly as much. They're doing better this generation, definitely better than they did with the Xbox One, and I would say closer along the lines as they are doing, or as they did with the Xbox 360. One of the things that was interesting with the Xbox 360 in Japan specifically is they actually had specific games that were just released there on the 360 that weren't available in the West. You'd have to import them to be able to play them. So that may be something that Xbox is going to continue to try to do with this generation going forward. Maybe look for games that will only be released there, or at the end of the day, that will be just vastly more popular in Japan and just throw them onto Game Pass, that everybody who wants to play them will be able to access them. Now it continues here. China's government under its leader Xi Jinping has clamped down on China's largest internet companies and urged businesses to adhere to the Communist Party's priorities. It has barred children from playing games on school days and tightened its already strict approval process for companies to distribute new games. Last year, China's $39 billion gaming market contracted for the first time in years. It says the private sector in China is in a very weak position now, said Duncan Clark, the chairman of the Beijing-based investment advisory firm BDA China. The cost of accessing the China market has gone up for Western companies, and for domestic companies, there is a greater fear of arbitrary regulations. And that's interesting because I don't know how that's going to affect. I mean, we're already seeing the effects with something like this where Activision Blizzard just pulls out. But how is that going to affect companies like Microsoft, massive $1 trillion companies, knowing that there's a lot of money to be made, but are these regulations worth playing in that market in a bigger way? That's something I think is going to have to be asked. And now, or I shouldn't say now because it hasn't passed yet, but let's say if that deal does pass for Activision Blizzard to become a part of Microsoft and part of Xbox, what are they going to do with those games? Are they going to try to enter back into the Chinese market with those games and come up with a deal that Activision Blizzard themselves, that Bobby Kotick himself wasn't able to make? Continues here and says in a statement, Michael Lee, an Activision vice president, said the company's experience in China had been very positive for nearly 20 years, including its decade-long partnership with Tencent to offer Call of Duty. While it's true that the partnership you're describing took a surprising and troubling turn, it's important to recognize that this was an anomaly, Mr. Lee said. Alexandru Voica, NetEase spokesman, said NetEase had moved on, and we suggest Activision Blizzard do the same. Since 2020, China's antitrust regulators have been reviewing old mergers and joint ventures that drew large amounts of foreign capital. New antitrust amendments last summer significantly raised the fine for failing to comply with those reviews. Last year, NetEase executives asked Activision to file relevant disclosures such as annual revenues and details about parts of its business to Chinese regulators. But Activision disputed that it was out of compliance with the law or that it was required to turn over more information, according to 4 people with knowledge of the situation and documents viewed by the Times. So that is pretty interesting because obviously they were just trying to dig further in to Activision, as they probably knew that they were making a ton of money off of the Call of Duty franchise, especially probably Call of Duty Mobile in China. And NetEase probably didn't like that. They probably wanted that to be looked into, and so that NetEase themselves could make more money with their own company. And I mean, it kind of says that here in this next section. It says, in the contract renegotiations with Activision conducted every few years since the partnership started, NetEase said it wanted to end the company's joint venture agreement, a business entity that helped NetEase distribute games from Blizzard Entertainment, an Activision subsidiary in China. NetEase said it wanted Activision to license its games directly to NetEase, which would give NetEase more control over operations and allow it to better comply with the new regulations without Activision's help. So they wanted to be more independent in how these games were being distributed. And this whole licensing thing, although this obviously isn't a direct comparison, is exactly kind of what is going on right now with Call of Duty and the Activision franchises, the licensing agreements that Microsoft is offering to all of these streaming companies for those 10-year deals, the worldwide royalty-free license to be able to take those IPs from Activision and be able to use them on all of these different platforms. And all of these companies are just going to have access to gamers who purchase these games and then use their streaming services to play them. So the licensing agreement here is what NetEase wanted. Maybe this is going to be something that Microsoft looks into. Maybe they will set up a deal with NetEase to license these games, since they seemingly are doing that with all of these other companies. I don't know if that's a good one-to-one comparison, but hey, you never know. It says Andrew Tang, a veteran gaming executive in China with close ties to Activision, said he thought NetEase was simply using the antitrust regulations as an excuse to get a better deal. And just from reading through this, as a layman, just reading through this, that's kind of what that sounds like to me. That obviously they are utilizing their own communist government's regulations to try to get a better deal from these companies in the West. NetEase is under a lot of pressure the last couple of years because of all of these crackdowns and limiting kids' play, Mr. Tang said. Ultimately, I think it all has to do with the bottom line. But tensions had been building before last year's contract renewal discussions, according to the people familiar with the talks. And this is where Bobby Kotick comes in. NetEase executives believed Bobby Kotick, Activision's chief executive, had made unreasonable demands over the years, two of the people said. In 2018, NetEase announced a $100 million investment in Bungie, a game developer that worked with Activision to produce Destiny, a popular game. Mr. Kotick was unhappy with the investment because Bungie was behind schedule on developing Destiny content, and he worried the investment would further distract the company from its Destiny obligations, to other people said. So that's a big thing here. That's one of the things with Activision Blizzard and Bobby Kotick, is they release Call of Duty every single year on time, doesn't get delayed. It has new content. Some people argue some years are worse than others, but they get those games out. They make them the most money in the gaming industry pretty much every single year. And that's why you could see, as Bobby Kotick, to him, it's just getting the content out there, releasing the game, and making the money off of it. And if they're behind schedule, you could see how that potentially would cause a worry, probably piss him off, because at the end of the day, it would hurt the bottom line if not enough content came out. And you think about the recent expansion that just came out with Destiny, and one of the complaints that I was reading, I didn't play it. I'm not a Destiny player, but one of the things I was reading a lot online where people were complaining that it wasn't a great expansion and that there wasn't enough content within that expansion. So maybe there was some relevant concerns here that Bobby Kotick did have. That year, NetEase invested in a game development company founded by a person who had until recently been a senior Activision employee, which also angered Activision. People said Mr. Kotick considered ending the partnership. A 2019 deal between Activision and NetEase included restrictions that prevented NetEase from hiring former employees or investing in gaming studios directed by them. So they have that in their contract. And it seems like after all of this went down, because this was in 2018, they say, that they made sure that that wouldn't be able to happen again, as they put in those clauses. Those tensions came to a head in a call last October. Mr. Kotick and William Ding, the chief executive of NetEase, discussed the many antitrust regulators around the world scrutinizing Microsoft's $70 billion deal to purchase Activision. Two people with knowledge of the call said Mr. Kotick told Mr. Ding that he would consider the licensing proposal, even though he worried that a switch could rattle Chinese regulators before an important political meeting that month and cede more control over Activision's intellectual property to NetEase. So they say this call happened last October. I'm sure there was some thoughts and discussions about licensing agreements for these video games from the Microsoft side, who probably spoke with Bobby Kotick and said, hey, we are going to be doing these licensing agreements. So maybe you tell NetEase that, you jump in there and we come up to some sort of agreement. As you can see here, Bobby Kotick said that to NetEase, that they were considering the licensing proposal. At some point in the conversation, which was conducted at times through translators, Activision executives felt that Mr. Ding threatened Mr. Kotick. The Chinese government was reviewing the Microsoft acquisition, and the executives recalled that Mr. Ding said NetEase could sway the government either to block or support that deal, depending on the outcome of the licensing discussion, according to two people familiar with the call and a document reviewed by the Times. Now, that is very interesting, because the latest news we have about China and the Activision Blizzard acquisition is that they're likely to go ahead and approve this deal. You have a massive company like Tencent who is for this deal. They're good with it. And then there was another company, which you can assume is NetEase, probably trying to persuade the government to block this deal. So I don't think there is an official decision yet from the China's State Administration for Market Regulation. But from what we understand right now is they are looking at approving this deal, and it's likely that it will happen. In fact, there was an update here. It says an earlier version of the story claimed that the merger would be approved in China in the coming days. We have amended this portion to say that the approval is expected, but no timeline is available on when they may be. So we don't know exactly when this approval or whatever they decide to do is going to happen. And now we're seeing here that there is tension between Kotick and NetEase, and NetEase probably pissed off. So they have that incentive to try to block this deal, especially if they aren't going to be getting the licensing agreement that they've been looking for. It continues here and says, but NetEase executives did not intend to make a threat and were trying to be conciliatory toward Activision, said two other people familiar with the conversation. The point they intended to make was that if Activision did not switch to a licensing deal, Microsoft would face the same regulatory hurdles when it acquired the company. Which, hey, you could argue they were right, as again, Microsoft has offered these licensing deals for Call of Duty and the Activision catalog to all of these third-party streaming services, again, royalty-free license. Now, Mr. Voica, the NetEase spokesman, denied that Mr. Ding had threatened Activision. He said Activision was continuing to harass and taunt companies and regulators worldwide. Microsoft declined to comment. After the Zoom call, Activision made a counteroffer. It would switch to a licensing agreement if NetEase paid a roughly $500 million upfront rather than in payments throughout the course of the deal, according to three people familiar with the negotiations. That was meant to insulate Activision from the risk that games could be tied up in government approval processes or be replicated without its consent. NetEase later said in a statement that Activision's terms were commercially illogical and the stage was set for the contract to expire in January. Now, when the breakup became public in November, it sent shockwaves through the Chinese gaming community. Shares of NetEase stock plunged in Hong Kong. As the time was running out, Activision made a last-ditch proposal to extend the partnership for 6 months so gamers could keep playing while it searched for a new long-term partner. As the business news site Yakai Global reported, NetEase declined the new offer and in a statement likened it to staying together while being divorced. In mid-January, NetEase contractors destroyed the World of Warcraft axe sculpture as the contractors swung hammers at it. Employees live streamed the demolition to 30,000 people. NetEase said local law required it to clear out another company's intellectual property after the partnership was terminated. So I guess they weren't just doing it out of revenge or vengeance. I guess at the same time, they were doing it because of the fact that they were required to do it by law to get rid of the stuff. But obviously they made a spectacle and a show of getting rid of the intellectual property, the World of Warcraft statue. In late January, most of the Activision's games, including World of Warcraft, Diablo 3, and Overwatch, went dark in China. Chinese companies, including NetEase, released games that some analysts said bore close similarities to the shuttered Activision titles. NetEase also made a recurring pitch to former World of Warcraft players, hoping to get them to join Justice Online, a NetEase game in the same genre as World of Warcraft. Online people posted photos of items from the Justice and Warcraft games that resembled each other. And NetEase says its games did not share similarities with Activision. Obviously, that's pretty hard to believe. They obviously looked at what World of Warcraft did well, copied a lot of it, and put it out there with slight variations and put it into their Justice Online game so that people who were on World of Warcraft had this opportunity to go to this alternative and think that they were getting a similar experience. Now, Activision has said that it plans to return to China and that it is in talks with other Chinese companies to distribute its games. In the past, both Tencent and ByteDance, which owns TikTok, have expressed interest in working with Activision. Activision has also considered teaming up with telecommunications companies like China Mobile, two people said. Now, that part is interesting because maybe if Microsoft, if this deal goes through, they're in talks with Tencent. They build a partnership where they're both kind of making money off of these properties. Maybe that's why they're so for this deal going through and telling the Chinese government to go ahead and approve this deal. For China gamers, the breakup was devastating. Zhang Yu, a 35-year-old World of Warcraft player in Beijing, said he was still mourning the loss of a game that had been a constant companion and connected with him with thousands of people since 2005. What I'm most worried about now, Mr. You said, is that these friendships will disappear. So there you have it. It's a pretty big article. Lots of big information that was in this article in terms of what actually happened between Activision Blizzard and NetEase and China and distributing these games in China. What I think is going to be more interesting, though, is these deals that are they're currently apparently in talks with. What is going to happen? What is Microsoft going to do? Because we know they are doing those licensing agreements. This is what NetEase wanted. And now, if they are in talks with a different company, the things that NetEase wanted, Tencent may get, which means that they're going to be getting a better deal than NetEase had, especially if it's a licensing agreement of some sort where they are making a decent amount of money off of it. So we'll see what happens. But Bobby Kotick is wrapped up in a lot of negative news in regards to Activision Blizzard, of course, with everything that happened at the company. And when or if this deal goes through, I'm sure he will be out. He won't be staying around at Microsoft, which may open up a lot more doors for companies that previously had bad relationships because of Bobby Kotick. But we will leave that there. Let me know what your thoughts are on this deal, on this article, and what is going on here with Activision Blizzard and China. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up. If you're new here, hit that subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.
Bye.